Thank you so much for taking time to join our webinar today, whether it be morning or night for you. Today's webinar is sponsored by the International Media Association for Peace, also known as IMAP. It's an initiative of the Universal Peace Federation. IMAP champions responsible and ethical media practices, understanding the profound influence that media platforms have in promoting peace and safeguarding freedom. IMAP's mission is to build a professional network of journalists dedicated to a culture of peace. This underscores the crucial role of media platforms in mobilizing support and raising awareness on a global scale. IMAP tackles these challenges by promoting ethical journalism and accurate content, highlighting the media's role in influencing public perceptions and fostering change. Our moderator today is Ray Lipowcan. Ray is a producer at Pittsburgh Community Television, where he produces programs highlighting Universal Peace Federation's domestic and international activities, while also producing programs of local interest. These can be seen on his YouTube channel at Ray Lipowcan. He also serves as the executive director of the Universal Peace Federation for Western Pennsylvania. So please join me in welcoming Ray Lipowcan.
All right, thank you so much, Peggy. And yes, welcome everyone. As Peggy said, we're the International Media Association for Peace. It's one of the associations of the Universal Peace Federation. And so thus our programs are always on the topic of media. And as we can see, I think everybody's probably seen a transformation taking place, certainly over the decades, but even the last few years, where the media seems to be, or to have a biased opinion or a biased perspective on a lot of the news. And I'm talking mostly like national news, international news, and obviously a lot of political news as well. But we want to focus today on our program on more of the influence that media might have on religion or religious organizations or even our moral values. So I think just to bring up a couple of things that I've just seen recently, apparently there's a new Disney movie that's come out that's very controversial. So again, they're using their platform of the movie to perhaps persuade people on their moral values. And so this is an issue. Another issue is that we're seeing a very strong anti-Jewish sentiment in the United States right now. So we have to ask, well, where does this come from? There are people watching news and they're hearing a certain perspective on Israel that maybe is not fair or unbiased, and so resulting in this anti-Jewish sentiment that's taking place. So we're going to be pursuing that discussion today. So our topic today is media reshaping our religious perceptions and beliefs, as well as our moral values. So we have two wonderful speakers with us today, two very respected journalists. The first one is Mr. Terry Mattingly. Terry's a veteran religion beat columnist in the mainstream press, and he's been 36 years with the National On Religion column and the former leader of the Washington Journalism Center program for the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. He's taught courses on mass media and religion at Denver Seminary, Milligan University, and Palm Beach Atlantic University. He's now a senior fellow at St. Constantine College in Houston. He currently is writing a Substack newsletter called Rational Sheep, focusing on issues of faith and family in the era of the digital screens. For 20 years, he led the GetReligion.org website, which is now a research archive on religious news coverage in the mainstream press. He's an Orthodox Christian husband, father, and grandfather, worshiping at St. Anne Orthodox Church in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Welcome, Terry.
Glad to be here. I'm going to focus today specifically on something that's related to my own graduate studies back at Baylor University soon after the cooling of the Earth's crust. I mean, that would be the mid-70s at this point. And Baylor actually has an interdisciplinary degree in church-state studies, which is a degree in theology, political science, history, and law. And you have to compete in graduate seminars in all four of those topics, including the law school. So I am not a lawyer, but I've had the the difficult pleasure of studying church-state law in a seminar at Baylor University. So I'm going to focus today on what is happening and why I think it's happening in media coverage specifically of the First Amendment and the First Amendment right of religious liberty, to be more precise. So let's start with something that happened just the other day. The other day, the Southern Baptist Convention held its annual meeting. And in the midst of that meeting, which there were a lot of headlines about the ordination of women and in vitro fertilization and a lot of other things, but they quietly passed a resolution, which, if you know anything about Baptist history, was really not all that unusual. But it's still good to listen to these wordings and ponder why this didn't get any press coverage. So let me read a little bit of the resolution. That we encourage and support robust Christian engagement in the public square, including individual Christians who pursue elected or appointed office in order to influence government by living out their Christian worldview while advocating Christian morals with respect for the consciences of all people. Jump down a few more lines, and then you really hit what I see as the what could have been headlines. We oppose any effort to establish a state religion of any nation, including the United States of America. And we refute the idea that God has commanded any state to establish any religion or any denomination, and we reject any government coercion or enforcement of religious belief, including blasphemy laws. One more clip from that we oppose any effort to use the people and churches of the Southern Baptist Convention to establish Christianity as the state religion of the United States of America, unquote. Now, I don't know about you, but that strikes me as interesting. And a liberal, both politically and doctrinally, a liberal Baptist from the Baptist News Global Network immediately spotted what the missing words were and why this resolution was brought to the floor and passed. The debate on this resolution mirrors the dividing line between those labeled as Christian nationalists, who believe God ordained America as a Christian nation, and those who seek religious liberty for all. Now, when you consider that despite some loss of membership during the non-denominational era in the United States, Southern Baptists remain the largest non-Catholic flock in the United States. Do you think, hang on a second, I forgot to push my stopwatch so that I would know how long I've been talking, which is always a good thing for someone raised as a preacher's kid. So this did not receive any significant coverage, despite the fact that the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant convention or denomination in the United States. I was curious as to why not. Now, the women's ordination coverage was really robust. It was everywhere. That's because you had an obvious gender issue, and that's considered instant news. And the in vitro fertilization resolution received tons of coverage. I would assume because it's linked to the Republicans and their scramble in a post-Roe era, and for the Southern Baptist Convention to try to decide what their moral theology is on that kind of issue. But in the end, this was essentially a victory for the old school Southern Baptist stance in favor of religious liberty. So why didn't this get any coverage? I believe two reasons. Number one, it did not include the words Christian nationalism. If it had, I think you would have seen a lot of coverage of this. Why? Because Christian nationalism is currently the template for all coverage of conservative evangelicals in America. Second, this was pro-religious liberty. And we live in an era where journalists have increasingly started putting the terms religious liberty, which is an old school old liberal piece of dialogue about the First Amendment. Religious liberty is not a new term. But what is new is increasingly seeing in the press religious liberty in quote marks. Well, if you know your journalism, you know that this is a phenomena referred to as scare quoting. This is when you put a term inside quotation marks. The Oxford Languages puts it this way: quotation marks used around a word or phrase when they are not required, thereby eliciting attention or signs of doubt. In other words, the Southern Baptist Convention voting in favor of religious liberty can't be real. It can't really be religious liberty because the Southern Baptist Convention is currently divided between enthusiastic Donald Trump voters and reluctant Donald Trump voters. There's no way that they could be favoring true religious liberty, where I would argue that that's exactly what they're favoring. Also, you need to know that in a recent poll, 90 to 92% of Southern Baptist laypeople and leaders in their churches said they still believed in religious liberty for all, regardless of faith or tradition. So, why was this story not covered? It was not covered because it didn't fit the current template. Now, also, I believe we have entered an era where religious liberty itself is now a term that people no longer agree on its importance. And like free speech and other First Amendment issues, America is kind of divided. When you begin to see the ACLU and the New York Times expressing doubt about the need for free speech, or whether free speech is perhaps negative or wrong, if it is hate speech, or if it's disinformation, and maybe we need a government agency to decide what's disinformation, etc. That's a long way from the 90s, the Bill Clinton era, when you, of course, had a vote in the U.S. Senate for the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the vote was 97-3. Can you imagine a landmark Religious Freedom Act passing in the U.S. Senate right now by 97-3? Can you even imagine it reaching the floor of the U.S. Senate for a vote? Okay, so what's going on here? Let me walk you through. I want to try to connect some dots. I really believe that's what's happened in the press is the press has decided that there is good religious liberty and there is bad religious liberty. We had a case in the court in 2022, Ramirez versus Collier, with an 8-1 majority, where the U.S. Supreme Court stood up for a crucial symbolic form of speech and action, which was the right of a condemned prisoner to have his chaplain with him in the execution chamber. Texas was trying to eliminate this right. And for just a moment, the old 1990s coalition in favor of religious liberty reunited with everyone from conservatives like the Christian Legal Society, the National Association of Evangelicals, the Southern Baptist Convention, Seventh General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, and a host of others joined with the American Civil Liberties Union and key voices on the old left to hail this decision by the court as a defense of a crucial religious liberty right. Okay, that's important. And that received positive, glowing press coverage. But a church-state philosopher, Francis Beckwith of Baylor, gave me an interesting quote. He said, people celebrated the Ramirez case because what the case was not about. It was not a case focusing, quote, on culture war issues that have dominated American politics in recent decades. Let me read another quote from him. Pastoral prayers with a prisoner facing death are the perfect example of what most people think of as religious acts. This case is about a man facing the end of his life, a moment when he is most vulnerable. Notice, he said, how we no longer have any religious liberty agreement surrounding issues of marriage. Marriage, because some forms of liberal religion and secular religion have decided that they have as much right to define First Amendment rights related to marriage as anyone else. This leads us to another form of religious liberty and thus religious liberty coverage. And that is what I would simply call bad religious liberty. Now, if you know the name Jack Phillips, you know that he is a cake baker in Colorado. You know that he has been taken into court over and over and over. He's been to the U.S. Supreme Court now once or twice, and it looks like he's headed there again. And why is that? Is this because, if you read the press coverage, is this because he fails to treat gay and lesbian customers with any respect like he does anyone else? Well, the famous case where Phillips refused to make a special created content-rich wedding cake for a gay couple was covered as him basically denying to do business with them. What he did was say, I do not make cakes that violate my conscience. And thus there are a wide variety of cakes he didn't make. He offered to sell the gay couple any cake that was in his store. He offered to sell them a cake plus materials for them to make their own symbolic cake or have someone else make it. He offered to cater their wedding. He offered to do anything except make a cake that expressed beliefs that he could not embrace. I have asked at Get Religion, I wrote several times asking, what would happen if a Black Pentecostal church tried to hire in Colorado a gay filmmaker to do a documentary about their church's weekend festival on people changing their sexual orientation in order to help God heal them and be straight? Do you think Colorado courts would require that filmmaker to make that film? Right now, Colorado courts won't even require t-shirt companies to make t-shirts that contain material that is offensive to them. What's special about Jack Phillips? Jack Phillips is guilty of bad religious liberty. He is speaking up for free speech and symbolic action on something that conflicts with the dominant religious liberty or free speech or political stands of our age. Now, since the Jack Phillips case before, we now have 303 Creative LLC versus Atlantis, which upheld the First Amendment, protected Colorado web designer Lori Smith from being compelled by the state to do content-rich services for same-sex weddings. It would seem that the Supreme Court has made itself clear on this issue. Then why is the Colorado court after Jack Phillips again? And why is the coverage of his claims that his First Amendment rights have been violated and that his religious liberties are at stake, why is the press treating his claims with such skepticism and overwhelming negativity when the Ramirez case was warmly greeted? Simply stated, Jack Phillips is clashing with templates. Okay, so next, we now get to how religion is covered in the press at all. I constantly hear from conservative Christians, hang on a second. I hear from conservative Christians during the 20 years I ran Get Religion. Overwhelmingly, people told me the press hates religion. This is simply inaccurate. The press is extremely positive about lots of religion and extremely negative about other religions. What's the difference? Simply stated, whether or not the religion violates the, shall we call them, doctrinal beliefs of the publication that's covering the story? Do the claims of religious liberty fit the template of the newsroom that's doing the coverage? Over the 20 years of Get Religion, this was the trend I saw that influenced our work the most. And in the end, this was the trend that led me to close the website, simply because I didn't believe it was possible to defend the American model of the press with its claims to show accuracy, fairness, and respect for people on different sides of issues. I could no longer defend that when the press was no longer in favor of that as a whole. So what's the difference? We're getting close now to another trend within our media. Does anyone these days know what the word liberal means anymore? And what does the word conservative mean anymore? I have frequently been called a conservative and even a bigot on occasion for defending stances that the ACLU would have defended strongly just 20 to 25 years ago. Old school First Amendment liberalism is now, in many cases, called conservative. The publication, The Free Press, on Substack, which I hope you're following, led by Barry Weiss and her wife, I should stress, has been called a conservative publication. These are liberal New York Jewish women in a same-sex relationship who are about to have a child, but they are still pro-First Amendment rights on free speech, and they defend the free speech of all kinds of people and believe the press should show respect for all kinds of people. It's interesting to me how Elon Musk went from being some sort of environmentalist liberal to being some sort of crazy conservative simply because he bought Twitter and decided not to silence specific voices who were, quote unquote, guilty of disinformation in debates on his platform. What does the word liberal mean? At Get Religion, I asked repeatedly, what is the accurate label? What is the accurate label for an American who is weak in their defense of free speech, religious liberty, and freedom of association? What should the press call such a person? Well, you can't call them a liberal because they're no longer defending what used to be at the core of American liberalism, which was the First Amendment. Are they progressives? A couple of years ago, in the midst of one dust-up on this, I asked a Muslim religious right activist, what do you call people who no longer defend free speech, religious liberty, freedom of association? And he waved his hands and said, please don't put this in the column, but I'm beginning to use the word Jacobin. I'm beginning to think that there are people who actually want a state religion of secularism, a state religion that approves only the religions that fit its doctrines. And this could get really out of control. And he's using Jacobin. Now, in conclusion, why is this happening at this point of time in journalism? I wrote a piece the other day, I guess it's coming up close to a year when I started writing it, for the Acton Institute and its journal Religion and Liberty. And the name of this piece was The Evolving Religion of Journalism. And writing this piece was like an act of grief for me. It had a lot to do with the death of the American model of press. And in it, I argued that the internet had essentially changed the business model for journalism in our culture. With advertising now dominated by the four small g gods of big tech, advertising is no longer a way that you can operate a publication in the United States and have it meet its bills. You are totally dependent on the goodwill of the people who are buying subscriptions to your publication. You must keep them happy at all cost. On television, whether you're Fox News or MSNBC, please your viewers and customers. Now, down here in the South, we have a phrase for that called preaching to the choir. And if you don't preach to the choir right now, you lose subscribers. My conclusion is that in an age in which advertising is no longer a leveling field that requires people to try to be fair, attempt to be fair, to people of a wide range of beliefs and viewpoints, and instead, your goal as an editor is to please your customers. What is the current doctrine of journalism when it comes to the First Amendment and all other controversial subjects? You might be familiar with the movie The Pirates of the Caribbean, at the end where you have someone saying, Jack, it's just good business. My conclusion is that we live in an age in which biased journalism is just good business. Keeping your customers happy is what you have to do to stay in business. And I'll end with one final point. We can all complain about New York and Washington, D.C., and the elite press of blue zip codes. I believe right now the most important thing is for readers, religious leaders, political leaders. We need right now to pay attention to what's happening in local and regional newsrooms, especially those close to state capitals. And please pay attention to the Associated Press. Watch the ever-evolving doctrines of the Associated Press Stylebook, which is the Bible of basic journalism in America, from sea to shining sea. If the Associated Press goes completely over to a biased model journalism, basically, we're back in the niche media age of the mid to late 19th century. And the American model of the press is gone. And this has a tremendous way of framing what happens in our coverage of First Amendment issues that I care a lot about, and I hope you do as well. Thank you.
Jerry, thank you so much. You brought up so many points. I think we could have multiple discussions just from your presentation. One point I appreciated you bringing up was the idea of lack of religious coverage, because I was talking in my introduction about communication or misperceptions about how the media is portraying religion. But of course, that's a big issue too, is lack of religious coverage in the media. And I'm glad you pursued it. You are an investigative journalist for sure. You pursued that issue, and thank you for the insights on that.
May I briefly
Please.
respond? Basically, please. Religion news is covered to the degree that it is linked to something that newsrooms value, which means the more a religion news subject is linked to politics, the more it will be covered, and it will be covered through the lens of politics. And I think that's devastating if you're trying to understand religious traditions as being in any way sincere about their own doctrines, customs, etc.
Good insight. Yes. Yeah, the state of journalism is certainly in a flux right now. And you had brought up about First Amendment issues as well. There's so many gray lines there. And as you said at Baylor, they study law as well in conjunction with their religious studies. And fortunately, our next speaker does have a law degree, Mr. Doug Bandow. And Doug is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties. He worked as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, and he's editor of the political magazine Inquiry. He writes regularly for leading publications such as Fortune Magazine, National Interest, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Times. He also speaks frequently at academic conferences, college campuses, and business groups. And he's been a regular commentator on all the major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, CNN, and he does hold a law degree from Stanford University. So welcome, Doug.
No, thank you, Ray. I appreciate the opportunity to appear. I very much enjoyed Terry's comments. And, I suffered through classes where I had to learn about legal cases regarding religion and, government in the United States, and they're quite painful, frankly. But I want to take a somewhat different tack. I'd like to look internationally. So hopefully, between Terry and I, we can cover kind of the waterfront of issues here and the role of the media and its impact on religion, religious liberty, politics, and persecution, which is a great interest of mine. As we have extraordinarily important issues both nationally and internationally when it comes to faith, matters of spirituality, and these need to be addressed, especially in the current age. If you look around the world, issues of religious liberty often get lost. Frankly, we look today at a world that seems filled with conflict. I mean, a terrible war going on in Europe, terrible conflicts going on in the Middle East, potential conflicts in Asia, a variety of the kind of sub wars, perhaps, say, in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. That, in all of these, one thinks about religious persecution, religious liberty issues, and it seems somewhat less important than the places where people are killing one another. But I think it's important to recognize that in many of these places, religion, in one way or another, is at the root of the conflicts or certainly exacerbates the conflicts. So, how those religious views are presented, how people perceive the faith, how they perceive their relationship with other faiths, have extraordinarily important consequences on those around them. And I just think, for example, Israel Palestinians, that this is a conflict. It's over land, it's over territory, but it also has matters of faith very deeply embedded. Israel and Iran, we see the same thing, that what's going on here is part geopolitics, but matters of faith matter a lot. The long running conflict between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and that Yemeni conflict now kind of flows over into the Israeli-Palestinian one. Again, there are issues of faith that are very important in these. One looks at almost all the Gulf states versus Iran. Again, these have gotten into kind of political issues and other things, but also matters of faith, the Shia-Sunni divide, these kinds of things matter very much. You look at a country like Myanmar or Sri Lanka, what one finds Buddhism and one finds other faiths, and these matter as part of internal conflicts, civil wars. One looks at India today, some of the civil conflicts, the role of Hindu nationalism and question of other faiths. Look at Nigeria, some of the worst conflict in Africa in terms of terrorist groups, in terms of attacks on civilians. Again, there's geopolitics, but there's an awful lot of religion as part of that. The Central African Republic, one looks at Somalia, one looks at attacks in Kenya. That all of these things kind of bring forth the whole question of faith and its larger impact. And it's very much tied into how the faiths are presented, how people perceive them, what they learn, what doctrines are taught. And I'd argue that there's a tendency, especially I think in kind of the normal foreign policy circles, to downplay the role of faith and religion, in part because these tend to be very secular worlds. And trying to understand the differences in faith and what motivates people isn't always easy. But if one looks at the status of religious liberty, the role of religious persecution, in many ways, it's almost like the famous canary in the mine. It's the early warning system of repression and oppression. That a system that doesn't protect the most fundamental freedom of conscience is very unlikely to protect other civil liberties. You're much less likely to have a democratic system. You're less likely to have a free press. You're less likely to have individual liberties in a system where that fundamental sense of you responding to the transcendent is your right as opposed to that of the state. Unfortunately, we see that is transmitted to other areas as well. We see that certainly with authoritarian states around the world. A country like Cuba, historically more Catholic, which has a very secular and oppressive regime. We see that a country like China, that once had a lot of Christian missionaries, North Korea as well. You see these kinds of issues pop up. And I think one thing that we see trying to understand the role of faith is how the regimes that tend to be feel most threatened, by religious liberty are the authoritarian totalitarian ones. That if you look at some of the lists, World Watch has one, some of the other World Vision. I mean, there are a number of faith groups out there that put out kind of lists of oppressors and try to rank order to some degree the worst. You look at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom does its own report. China is at the top of the list, North Korea, Russia, Iran, Central Asia. What you find is in many cases, these are secular states that find any faith a threat because, any faith basically says you're responsible to somebody other than the state. And the media then is drawn into this. The question of can these faiths propagate their own views? How does the government itself try to manipulate the press, manipulate coverage, manipulate social media to try to limit them and to try to, in many cases, frankly, eradicate them, from their societies? And there's always been persecution and oppression. I mean, one can famously think of the Roman Colosseum. But what's tragic is you look over your last decades, we can see countries where persecution has gotten an awful lot worse. We're supposed to be moving into this new progressive age, all these wonderful advanced technologies, and what we see is it's even more hard. It's harder for people of faith to live out their lives, according to that faith. One looks at a country like Afghanistan that, a few decades ago, before the rise of the Taliban, you had a much more liberal society that in places like Kabul, women could dress as they wished. People could be much more liberal in their views. They differed from the countryside, but this was a country that allowed a certain diversity of religious belief. Iran, we see much the same thing. Iran under the Shah, was a very different place religiously than it is today. China, as I mentioned, had famous, missionaries. I mean, Chariots of Fire, the movie, was kind of based in part on one of the famous, Eric Liddell, one of the famous missionaries in China. North Korea once was, had a very strong religious tradition. Indeed, the parents of the, first dictator, Kim Il-sung, were actually religious. That matters, and one looks at India today. I mean, India, a few decades ago was a more secular place. Today, much more, religious and often repressive religious activism. The Pew Research Center has done wonderful studies on this, and it shows two strains here. Part of it is social activism and social attitudes. That's where some persecution comes from. And the other is government policy. And these are very different, but often come together. And the social attitudes are heavily influenced by the media, and these days, especially social media. That's one area where, it's very easy, unfortunately, to stir up people, to create very intolerant attitudes. And then you find states are quite willing to use this, sometimes to oppress religions they don't like, sometimes to advance religions that they find helpful. And the question is, why do we see these increases? What's going on? And I think it's important to try to understand what's going on. To try to understand it is not an attempt to justify it. Unfortunately, we're in a world today where you try to explain why certain people behave one way or another, you're often attacked as supporting them. But if we don't understand what's going on, it's much harder for us to address them. And I think there are a number of reasons. I mean, one policy, quite honestly, is, sometimes the great powers, including the United States, kind of muck around where they shouldn't. And you blow up countries, and suddenly you find what comes out of the horror of war and conflict very often is the most extreme religious sentiments, very often promoted through social media and other things. One thinks, for example, of Iraq and Syria, which were run by secular dictators, nasty people. But there was relative religious liberty in those countries. That is, in both those countries, Christians existed, Yazidis, Baha'is. Other people of faith who were religious minorities were protected. Very different from their situation today. One looks at a country of Iran, very secular under the Shah. Now, this was not a nice guy at all. The problem is, the process of, involvement in putting him into power and supporting him, helped promote some of the religious fundamentalism that we see that's metastasized into one of the worst oppressive regimes, supported by media, with enormous government attempts to try to control social media, which is seen as threatening to the regime. So we see these kinds of, things. We see that's, I think, one area that one has to look at. Another area is, frankly, bad governance at home. That you look, especially in the Middle East, I mean, very young populations with very little economic opportunity run by oppressive dictatorships that try to maintain stability, well, people react against that. And one place they look for answers, frankly, is faith. And who gives them answers? Well, if secular liberals don't seem to have an answer to the dictator, they look for religious extremists. And there again, one of the unfortunate things about a world of social media today is that even if the state, the normal media, the old media, is controlled by the state, there's a way to get around that. And that has helped promote. We see the rise, for example, the Islamic Brotherhood. You see the rise of some of the leadership of ISIS and other things. These are people that came out of Egyptian prisons. That what we saw, and those were fomented by and promoted, by social media. The whole rise of ISIS, I mean, horrendous videos, use of YouTube and other things, even kicked off YouTube. They have their own sites, videos that, were circulated, the social media that promoted the worst extremist views. We also see that where you see state failure, people are reacting not necessarily directly against the state, but they're looking for other answers. And I think you see that, as I mentioned, Middle East, a country like India, large population, looking for, better economic, answers. And so if you don't find that in the secular world and your government's not working very well and the government's not giving you a lot of economic opportunities, you look for something else. And then I think finally, we have to look at media and communication, that it's so much easier these days to communicate to, the wider population. And there's obviously a good and a bad. I mean, it's wonderful for, faiths to be able to evangelize around the world and find a way to get around oppressive governments. On the other hand, the people who have ill thoughts, those who are promoting totalitarian ideologies and theologies, those who are promoting theologies of violence also are able to use those. And, we try to stop that. We try to get, many, in the US, a lot of controversy. How do you prevent false news, fake news? How do you, at what point do you decide that something is beyond the pale? What is beyond the discussion level? But it's very hard to do that, because how do you maintain a free society that has, a First Amendment that's serious and allow people to discuss views that may be out of fashion? I mean, as Terry talked about today, we have a lot of gatekeepers who view almost anything of kind of small o orthodox, and that could be Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Islam, Orthodox other things are viewed as somehow beyond the pale. That those people tend to get excluded, not just those who might be promoting violence and promoting, kind of the more totalitarian theologies that are an extraordinary threat. So the question is, how do we deal with this? These new technologies, media technologies, provide opportunities to organize, to create organizations, to spread views, to spread, good and ill, and that goes worldwide. I mean, what's extraordinary here is that you can create an organization and now have financial support around the world. You can spread your views around the world. And that's clearly is a problem in some of the issues, say, of ISIS, where groups like ISIS have become ones that promote themselves. I mean, we've had the lone wolves in the United States who, enamored of an ISIS ideology, well, they pick that up typically through social media. They find conduits, they're preached to, and then they go out and hurt their fellow citizens. So, we're living in a world of all these international challenges, and it's important for us to recognize if we want to deal with them, there's a lot of geopolitics, but matters of faith and spirituality also matter, and matter hugely. And we have to find ways, talk with one another, find ways to cooperate among different faiths, and look at ways, how do we help harness the power of media and for good, of communication, of all these new technologies, while finding ways to constrain the negative that comes out of it. Because that negativity, very often, it's not just bad policy, it's lives. It's the destruction of societies. I mean, we look at, what's happened to, some of these countries and the destruction of all the social institutions, everything, it can be very, very damaging. So, in the end, I think this is a great opportunity to talk about these issues. And I want to emphasize that Terry's brought up some very important issues in terms of America and our national policy of the threats to religious liberty and the problems in the United States. These issues also range around the world, incredibly complex. So I hope our listeners will stay involved in these issues and be involved in the future to look for answers. So I thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, likewise, so many excellent points that you made. And yeah, one key point again is the more tolerant or stable the democracy is, or I should say, the more stable a country is, the more tolerant they are of religious views. And I really had an insight into that this past January, and I think you were there too at the International Religious Freedom Summit in Washington. And I was so grateful after I left for living in the United States, after hearing stories from Hong Kong and Nicaragua and the Uyghurs and Afghanistan. And as you're saying, those unstable democracies don't have much tolerance. So thank you so much for your insight. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Michael Jenkins, who's the chairman of Universal Peace Federation North America, if you'd like to offer a few comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you, both Terry and Doug. I really respect the thoughts that you brought forth. We've worked with Mr. Bandow on many areas of freedom and also the situations in Northeast Asia. But Ray, I think this is an excellent program. I think you're taking the International Media Association for Peace to a completely different level of engagement. I think actually having time with news media professionals, especially in the more clearly grounded in the happening and what's going on in the local communities with religion, and this last couple sessions we've had is really interesting. Terry, I was fascinated by some of the things that you shared, that the newsroom, because I work with the Washington Times. I'm chairman of the Washington Times Holdings. And I'm always fascinated by how do people come up with a very strong newsroom that's really supportive of all religions. And for you to share that, the fundamental beliefs or doctrines that people share should not get in the way of their reporting. But actually, it's not easy for people to be totally objective if they've already had a preconceived, conclusion about different religions. It takes a lot to become interfaith or interreligious or inter-respecting all. We had a tremendous experience taking fact finders to Jerusalem and going to Palestine, Ramallah, Gaza Strip, up to Lebanon, Jordan. And it was not an easy thing for the participants. We had an interfaith delegation, but we found that it was very, very challenging for many people to overcome even the idea that other Christians are not Christians, from one denomination to the other. And then when you go from Christian to Muslim, it's a huge leap for many. Things are changing. It's definitely a new age, but this IMAP program, Ray, is really bringing this out. And Doug, I think your insights and understanding into freedom really have impacted our work, especially in Northeast Asia. And we're dealing with North Korea that has no religion that's permitted. There is religion there underground, but we're dealing with China also in that kind of area. And I think those ideologies cannot be avoided either. They're like religion, and especially North Korea is like a religious belief system that the great leader, the dear leader, they're eternal, especially great leader Kim Il-sung is eternal. And it's like it's a form of religion. But then dealing with the fact that China also has ideologies that say there is no God, but that's actually, it becomes something you can't avoid. It's really like a religion. So thank you for these insights. Ray, wonderful program, and Peggy, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Well, it wasn't planned, but we did get a nice domestic and international perspective on this issue. So thank you to both of you. I was going to ask for some closing comments, and if I may kind of pose a small question, and both of you pretty much touched on it, I think, a little bit, but if maybe you could expound a bit. I guess look into your crystal balls, and what do you think it would take to stop I'll use the word erosion of our values and liberties that we're seeing here in America. You know, the morals, I guess you can say, both domestically and internationally. Terry?
Well, I'm going to refer to a book by a friend of mine. His name is David French. I've known him for almost 25 years in his work on First Amendment issues. He wrote a book which, frankly, a lot of the David French haters needed to read a couple of years ago, called Divided We Fall. And he essentially noted in there that probably the best we can hope for at this point would be some sort of Supreme Court decision strongly affirming federalism. Some belief that not everyone in the United States has to have exactly the same policies on healthcare, you know, and then a host of other issues. I find that somewhat a depressing hope that that's the best we can do. But I frankly think that is more likely than a change in the internet business model. I would, besides really focusing, and I mean focusing hard, critical attention on the Associated Press by religious leaders in our country, I think the leaders of major denominations and stuff should literally, on some occasions, camp out in the office, the lobby of the Associated Press headquarters or something, and demand a chance to talk about some of these issues, you know, when changes are made in style books and stuff like that. But I really don't know what's going to change the business model. You can support new publications that may not be the old American model of the press, which, by the way, I wanted to agree that no one believes that objectivity was easy or perfect. The difference was, what was your goal? In other words, if you're not even striving to treat people on both sides of stories with respect, and if you're arguing about what constitutes accuracy, or about whether, to name one example, Republicans are manipulating a video when they're putting something out that hasn't been edited at all. I mean, we live in a crazy age in social media. Well, what do? I would suggest, for example, that people look at this publication called The Free Press. It's not perfect. Parts of what it does are going to infuriate you, and that's probably good. Pick a few projects that you believe you can support and try to support them. Help people do their best.
All right. Thank you, Terry. Before we get to Dr. Jenkins for a concluding comment, Doug, would you like to offer something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an extraordinary challenge we face. I think very highly of David French. I think he's one very serious about his faith, who's addressed these issues, and does not take a partisan role. I mean, he's one who's tried to address it seriously as opposed to look for political advantage. And to me, that's essential. I think there's a challenge to folks across the political spectrum. I mean, I think the folks on the more conservative side have to work better to make clear they are not imperialists in the political process, that they want what everyone else wants, is a better society, a better world for their kids and grandkids, and that we need to work together and we need to work past our religious differences. I think folks on the left, I think this is where there's kind of a moderate section of liberalism of people who I think essentially are not very happy with some of the stuff they see, the kind of heavy woke political craziness,
right,
but are afraid to do anything. And they look for, just leave me alone, let the alligator eat everybody else, and hopefully it won't come for me. And to my mind, this, Terry mentioned that you go back to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I mean, this was a huge majority, because at that point, even folks on the left realized religious liberty was important. Now it's become so much more politicized that it's fine to have religious liberty for Quakers. But if those Southern Baptists come along, who are kind of right-wing in their political views, it must be a bad thing. And to me, this is where we need folks to step out and recognize, if you want to protect liberty, you got to protect it for the other guy. That you cannot act as if only you can be protected and everybody else gets thrown to the wolves. Internationally, I think we need to have countries and people and governments recognize, you want a stable, prosperous society, you need to include all your people. You can't exclude religious minorities. You can't exclude chunks of your population. You can't persecute. I mean, what that does to societies. In all these cases, you try to force your views fundamental views of the transcendent on others, you're going to get conflict. This is a real challenge for all of us. And I'm very glad to see this discussion. We need more of this.
Thank you, Doug. Dr. Jenkins?
Thank you, Ray. Just a mention for highergroundtimes.com. The Washington Times found it could not really reach the religious community effectively, even though the values were shared. And so a portal was made called highergroundtimes.com. And it's actually in the daily paper. It's in the website for the whole newspaper. But it was very interesting because Christians didn't want to wade through the political stuff to get to the Christian relevant or articles on religious freedom and Supreme Court and everything like that. And by putting a portal there and actually promoting it directly to Christians, it's been a huge response. Very, very surprising. So I think that Terry and Doug, your insights on this is very, very important. We're in a changing environment. I'm so grateful for this IMAP to address this from a media perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. So, yeah, thank you to everyone for joining us today. And as we said in the beginning, when Peggy gave the intro at IMAP, we're promoting ethical journalism, and we definitely had two wonderful journalists with us today. So, Terry and Doug, thank you so much for joining us, and everybody as well on YouTube and Facebook. And also, I just wanted to mention that every Tuesday we have a webinar on UPF at 2 p.m. Eastern time every Tuesday. So please look at our website, us.upf.org, and you can find us there. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.